I never thought I'd be the one to tell a story like this. Men like me, we don't talk about the things we've seen beyond the veil. But I'm getting older now, and I think some stories need to be told, especially when they change you from the inside out. When they give you a message you can't ignore. I was just a kid from Wilmington, Delaware when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. 22 years old, working at my father's hardware store, engaged to my high school sweetheart, Mary. I remember hearing the news on the radio that Sunday, my father going quiet, that distant look in his eyes that I'd seen sometimes when he'd mentioned the Great War. The war he never really talked about. 2 weeks later, I enlisted in the Navy. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Every able-bodied man I knew was signing up. We were angry, determined, naive about what was coming. My name is Thomas William Hartley. I served as a gunner's mate second class aboard the USS Franklin, an Essex-class aircraft carrier. We called her Big Ben. She was magnificent. 27,000 tons of American naval power. I was assigned to one of the 5-inch gun mounts, trained to load and maintain those massive weapons. We protected the ship from air attacks, supported landing operations, and occasionally engaged enemy vessels. Basic training went by in a blur of exhaustion and transformation. I arrived at Great Lakes Naval Training Station in January of '42, a hardware store clerk with soft hands and civilian habits. 8 weeks later, I left a sailor, my body hardened, my mind disciplined to respond to orders without question. They beat the individual out of you and rebuilt you as part of something bigger. I'll never forget the first time I saw the Franklin. March 1944, after being shipped across the country to San Diego. She was docked there, enormous beyond anything I'd imagined, her massive hull and flight deck stretching what seemed like forever. The sailors already aboard moved with purpose, like parts of a complex machine. I was terrified and exhilarated at the same time. "Quite a sight, ain't she?" A voice came from beside me as I stared up at the ship. I turned to see a weathered chief petty officer, maybe 15 years my senior, smoking a cigarette. "Yes, sir," I replied, still transfixed. "Don't sir me, son. I work for a living," he said with a half smile. "Chief Donnelly, I'll be running your gun crew." "Hartley, sir. Chief. Gunner's mate second class." He studied me for a moment, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "First time on a carrier?" "First time on anything bigger than a rowboat, Chief." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh that put me slightly at ease. "Well, Hartley, you've got a lot to learn, and not much time to learn it. We ship out in 3 days." Chief Donnelly became something of a mentor to me in those early days. He was a Pearl Harbor survivor, had been aboard the USS Nevada when the Japanese attacked. He never talked about it directly, but sometimes late at night on watch, he'd get a distant look and mention a name. Always just a name, nothing more. Williams, Petrovich, Sullivan. Just names of men who never came home. My gun crew became my family. 7 of us manning that 5-inch monster. Reynolds was our gun captain, a former high school teacher from Oregon with glasses too big for his face and the steadiest hands I'd ever seen. Martinez was our pointer, controlling the gun's elevation, always humming Spanish lullabies under his breath. Jackson was the trainer, moving the gun horizontally, a former boxer from Chicago with forearms like tree trunks. Campbell was our other loader, a farm boy from Kansas who could lift ammunition like it was made of paper. Wilson was sight setter, a quiet college kid who'd left Yale to enlist. And Peterson, our phone talker, connected us to the bridge. A skinny Norwegian kid from Minnesota who never stopped talking unless we were in combat. We practiced until we could load, aim, and fire in our sleep. 20 rounds per minute was the goal, and Chief Donnelly wouldn't let us rest until we hit it consistently. The 5-inch shells weighed 54 pounds each. In the beginning, my arms would shake after an hour of drills. By the time we shipped out, I could go all day. Life aboard ship settled into a rhythm. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off, then repeat. Meals in the crowded mess hall. Card games during downtime. Letters from home when mail call came. I wrote to Mary every day, even when nothing happened worth telling her about. I kept her photo in a waterproof pouch in my pocket. Dark hair, bright smile, eyes that seemed to follow me even in the flat photograph. We joined the 3rd Fleet in the Pacific in June 1944. By then, the tide of the war had turned. We were on the offensive island hopping toward Japan. The Franklin's air group would fly missions against Japanese positions, and we'd provide support fire when needed. Between operations, we'd refuel, rearm, and wait for the next assignment. My first taste of combat came during the Marianas Campaign. We were supporting the invasion of Saipan, our planes hitting Japanese positions ahead of the Marines' landing. The Japanese sent aircraft against our fleet, I remember the general quarters alarm blaring, running to my station, the sweat already soaking through my dungarees in the Pacific heat. "Man your stations!" Reynolds shouted as we piled into the gun mount. The steel door clanged shut behind us, sealing us in our own little world of metal and machinery. The gun mount was hot, stuffy, loud when firing. But it was where we belonged when the shooting started. "Range 8,000 yards, bearing 045. Peterson called out, relaying information from the bridge. We loaded, trained the gun, waited for the order to fire. The first Japanese plane appeared as a tiny dot on the horizon, growing larger by the second. "Commence firing!" The gun roared, the recoil shaking the entire mount. The smell of cordite filled the air. We fell into our rhythm, load, aim, fire, reload. I barely had time to think, operating on training and instinct. When it was over, we'd helped shoot down 3 Japanese aircraft. The pride I felt was immediate and overwhelming, until Chief Donnelly reminded us that pilots had died in those planes. "Never celebrate death, boys," he said quietly. "Respect the fight, respect the enemy, but never cheer another man's passing into darkness." We saw more action over the following months. The Philippines, Iwo Jima. Each engagement left me a little more hardened, a little less the hardware store clerk from Delaware. I stopped counting the number of general quarters alarms, stopped feeling the same rush of fear each time. It became routine, in the way terrible things can become routine in war. I made friends beyond my gun crew. James Sullivan from Massachusetts, a radio man who played the harmonica at night when the weather was good. Bobby Chen from San Francisco, an aircraft mechanic who could fix anything with moving parts. And closest of all, Philip Morris. Yes, like the cigarettes, and we never let him hear the end of it. A quartermaster from Georgia with an easy laugh and stories for every occasion. Phil and I were opposites in many ways. He was outgoing, always ready with a joke, while I was quieter, more reserved. But we bonded over a shared love of baseball and the packages our families would send. His mother made the best pecan cookies I've ever tasted, and she always sent enough to share. "My mama says a man can't be brave on an empty stomach," Phil would say as he passed around the latest batch. It was Phil who kept me grounded when the letters from Mary started coming less frequently. By early 1945, what had been daily letters became weekly, then occasionally longer gaps. "She's just busy with the war effort," Phil assured me as we shared a smoke on deck one night, the stars impossibly bright over the Pacific. "All the girls are working in factories now, doing their part." "Maybe," I said, unconvinced. Her last letter mentioned a co-worker named David 3 times. Phil laughed. "3 times, huh? You counted?" "Didn't have to." His name jumped out like it was written in red ink. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Thomas, my friend, you're jumping at shadows. The girl agreed to marry you. She's waiting for you." I nodded, wanting to believe him. "But war changes things back home too, not just the men who fight it." I tucked that worry away, focusing on survival instead. March 1945 found us supporting the invasion of Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before a potential invasion of Japan itself. The fighting was fierce. The Japanese were defending their home waters with everything they had, including a new terrible weapon, the kamikaze. We'd seen suicide attacks before, but nothing like this. Organized squadrons of aircraft, pilots trained specifically to crash their planes into our ships. They called themselves the Divine Wind, after the typhoon that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries ago. Chief Donnelly gathered us for a briefing before we entered the combat zone. "These men are not afraid to die," he said solemnly. "They believe their death will serve their emperor and their country. That makes them more dangerous than anything we faced before. Stay sharp, stay focused. If they get past our cap, we're the last line of defense." KAP, or Combat Air Patrol, was our fighter screen, F-6F Hellcats flying from our deck to intercept enemy aircraft before they could reach the fleet. But they couldn't catch everything. On March 19, 1945, we were operating about 50 miles off the coast of Kyushu, launching airstrikes against Japanese airfields. It was early morning. I'd just come off the midnight to 4 a.m. watch and was having breakfast in the mess hall when the general quarters alarm sounded. This is not a drill. "All hands, man your battle stations. Enemy aircraft approaching." I dropped my fork mid-bite, coffee spilling as I jumped up. The mess hall erupted in controlled chaos, hundreds of men moving rapidly to their stations. I ran for my gun mount, passing through narrow passageways already crowded with sailors rushing to their posts. I made it to my position in under 2 minutes. Reynolds was already there, as was Martinez. The others arrived seconds after me. We closed the hatch, sealing ourselves in, and prepared for action. Multiple bogies approaching from the south. Peterson relayed from the bridge. Range 15 miles and closing fast. We loaded the gun, the familiar weight of the shell in my arms, the mechanical click as it seated in the breech. Above us, on the flight deck, our aircraft that hadn't yet launched were spotted forward, preparing for takeoff to join the defense. The ship's 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire first, their distinctive chatter reaching us even inside our mount. Then our 5-inch guns joined in, including ours. The concussion from each shot was physical, pressing against my chest, the noise deafening despite our sound-protective headgear. We fired at the radar-directed coordinates, though we couldn't see the targets ourselves from within the mount. The rhythm of combat settled over us. Load, fire, reload. My arms moved automatically, muscles remembering what to do without conscious thought. Then came the first impact. Not on our ship, but close enough that we felt the shockwave. One of our escort destroyers had been hit. "Keep firing," Reynolds shouted over the din. Another impact, closer this time. The ship shuddered. Still not a direct hit on us, but nearby. The pace of enemy attacks increased. We could feel the Franklin maneuvering, turning hard to port, then to starboard, trying to present a difficult target while maintaining enough steady course for our anti-aircraft batteries to fire effectively. Then it happened. The ship seemed to lift beneath us. A massive explosion, far larger than anything I'd felt before. The gun mount shook violently. I was thrown against the steel wall, pain shooting through my shoulder. Emergency lights flickered. "What was that?" Campbell shouted. "Direct hit," Reynolds answered grimly. "Keep to your stations." We continued firing, but now the ship felt different beneath us. Listing slightly, vibrations through the hull changing in character. Through the speaking tube, we heard scattered reports from other parts of the ship. Flight deck hit, fires spreading, damage control teams responding. We kept loading and firing. That's what you do in combat. Your job, nothing more, nothing less. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. A second massive explosion rocked the ship, even larger than the first. This time I was thrown completely off my feet. My head struck something hard, and momentary darkness washed over me. When I came to, seconds later, smoke was filling the gun mount. We need to get out," Reynolds was shouting. "Mount's compromised." He was struggling with the hatch, which had jammed from the concussive force of the explosion. Jackson moved to help him, the two men straining against the warped metal. With a screech of protest, it finally opened. Smoke and heat immediately rushed in. The scene outside was chaos. The once orderly passageway was now filled with wounded men, emergency lighting casting everything in a hellish red glow. A damage control party rushed past us, carrying fire hoses. "Report to secondary battle stations." An officer was shouting further down the passageway. We moved as a group, our gun crew staying together even in the chaos. Up one ladder, down a passageway, navigating by instinct and training through the smoke-filled interior of the ship. We were heading for our secondary position, a 40mm anti-aircraft mount on the port side. We never made it there. The third explosion was different, closer, more directed. Later, I would learn it was caused by a chain reaction of aircraft bombs cooking off in the intense heat of the fires. In that moment, all I knew was sudden, overwhelming force and heat. The deck beneath us buckled. There was a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bulkhead to our right disappeared in a flash of orange and white. I felt myself lifted and thrown, a rag doll in the hands of an angry god. I struck water, the shock of cold a stunning contrast to the heat of the explosion. The impact drove the air from my lungs. Disoriented, I sank beneath the surface, the weight of my clothing and boots pulling me down. Survival instinct kicked in. I fought to orient myself, to find the surface. My lungs were burning as I kicked upward, shedding my heavy boots underwater as we'd been trained to do. Just as the need for air became unbearable, I broke the surface, gasping and coughing. The salt water burned my eyes and throat. The scene around me was apocalyptic. The Franklin, my home for nearly a year, was engulfed in flames from bow to stern. Her flight deck was obscured by black smoke punctuated by orange fireballs as aviation fuel and munitions continued to explode. Men were in the water all around me, some swimming, some clinging to debris, some floating face down. "Hartley," a voice called from nearby. "Hartley, over here!" It was Martinez, clinging to a floating wooden crate about 20 yards away. I swam toward him, each stroke an effort in my waterlogged clothing. As I reached him, I saw that his face was badly burned on one side, the skin red and already blistering. "Have you seen the others?" I asked as I grabbed onto the crate. He shook his head. I saw Reynolds and Peterson right before the blast. They were ahead of us. I don't know if they made it out. We scanned the water around us. The sea was dotted with men and debris. Some of the ship's whaleboats were in the water now, crews rowing toward the swimmers most distant from the burning carrier. Other ships in the task force were maneuvering to assist, though they had to keep their distance from the Franklin, which was now a floating bomb of exploding munitions. There, Martinez pointed. Is that Jackson? About 50 yards away, a large figure was helping a smaller man stay afloat. Even at that distance, I recognized Jackson's powerful build. We began paddling our crate in that direction, calling out. Jackson saw us and began swimming toward us, still supporting the other sailor, who appeared barely conscious. As they got closer, I saw it wasn't one of our gun crew, but a young seaman I didn't recognize. His white uniform was stained red across the chest. His name's Parker, Jackson said as they reached our crate. Shrapnel wound. We need to get him onto something solid. Together, we managed to arrange our crate and some additional floating debris into a makeshift raft. We heaved Parker onto it as gently as we could. The young man, he couldn't have been more than 18, was pale beneath the soot and blood on his face. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Anybody see Campbell or Wilson? Jackson asked, his eyes continuing to scan the water. We hadn't. The four of us, Jackson, Martinez, Parker, and myself, clung to our small island of debris as the Franklin continued to burn a few hundred yards away. The heat from the fire was intense even at that distance. The ship was listing heavily now, though she remained afloat, a testament to the damage control training and brave men still fighting to save her. Time became fluid as shock set in. It could have been minutes or hours that we drifted. Parker's condition worsened. His breathing became more labored, his skin grayer. I held onto his hand, telling him to hang on, that help was coming, that he would be fine. I'm not sure he heard me. Sometime during our drift, he stopped breathing. We said a brief prayer, then had to let his body slip into the sea. There was nothing else we could do. Eventually, a destroyer, I think it was the USS Hunt, but I can't be certain, came alongside our makeshift raft. Sailors threw us lines and pulled us aboard. The deck was already crowded with other survivors from the Franklin. Medical corpsmen moved among the wounded, doing what they could with limited supplies. I collapsed on the deck, exhaustion finally claiming me. My last memory before unconsciousness took me was searching the faces around me, looking for the rest of my gun crew, looking for Phil, looking for Chief Donnelly. I didn't see any of them. I woke up in what had been the destroyer's mess hall, now converted to an overflow medical space. Rows of wounded men lay on tables and on the floor. A corpsman noticed I was awake and came over, offering me water. How long was I out? I asked, my voice raspy from smoke and salt water. About 3 hours, he replied. You've got some burns on your arms and a nasty gash on your head, but you'll be okay. Luckier than most. I tried to sit up, which proved more difficult than expected. My body felt like one massive bruise. The Franklin? I asked. The corpsman's face tightened. Still afloat, last I heard. Fire's under control, but she's bad, real bad. They're saying hundreds dead, maybe more. The number hit me like a physical blow. Hundreds. All men I'd lived alongside, eaten with, worked with. All gone. My gun crew, I started. Did anyone? I don't know, buddy, he said gently. We've got about 80 Franklin survivors aboard. There are others on different ships. Some were taken back to the Franklin once the fires were under control. There's no way to know right now. Over the next day, as I recovered enough to move around, I searched the destroyer for familiar faces. I found Jackson, his right arm now bandaged from a burn I hadn't noticed in the water. Martinez was in worse shape, his facial burns severe enough that they'd given him morphine for the pain. Of Reynolds, Peterson, Campbell, and Wilson, I found no sign. I also looked for Phil Morris, my closest friend aboard the Franklin. I asked everyone I met if they'd seen a quartermaster from Georgia, about 5'10", with reddish-brown hair. No one had. 2 days later, those of us who were ambulatory were transferred to the USS Santa Fe, a light cruiser that had come alongside the burning Franklin in an act of incredible bravery, taking off hundreds of wounded men. The Franklin herself, despite the catastrophic damage, remained afloat and was under tow, heading slowly away from the combat zone. Aboard the Santa Fe, I finally found Chief Donnelly. He was sitting on a crate on the deck, smoking a cigarette, his right leg heavily bandaged. Hartley, he said when he saw me, a rare smile breaking through his usually stoic expression. Thought we'd lost you. I sat beside him. Nearly did, Chief. Have you heard anything about the rest of the crew? His expression darkened. It's bad, son. Real bad. They're saying almost 800 dead. Hundreds more wounded. 800 men. The number was incomprehensible. Reynolds? Peterson? Connery? Campbell? Wilson? I asked, knowing the answer, before he spoke from the look in his eyes. Reynolds and Peterson made it. They're back on the Franklin, helping with damage control. Campbell, he was right at the center of that third explosion. Never had a chance. He paused. No word on Wilson yet. I nodded, absorbing the loss of Campbell. He'd been the strongest of us all, the farm boy who could lift shells like they were nothing. Now he was gone. What about Phil Morris? I asked. Quartermaster Georgia boy? Chief Donnelly shook his head slowly. Sorry, son. Morris was on the bridge when the first bomb hit. Direct impact. They never found enough to bury. I felt something break inside me. Phil, with his easy laugh and stories and his mother's pecan cookies. Phil, who had assured me that Mary was waiting faithfully for me. Phil, my friend, gone in an instant. I don't remember much of the next few days. Grief and shock wrapped around me like a fog. I functioned, ate when food was put in front of me, answered when spoken to, but I wasn't really there. I kept seeing Phil's face, hearing his voice, and Campbell's, and all the others who hadn't made it. The Santa Fe delivered us to Guam, where a field hospital had been established for Franklin survivors. I was examined, my minor wounds treated, and placed in a general recovery ward. The doctors were concerned about lung damage from smoke inhalation, but physically, I was one of the lucky ones. It was on my third night in the hospital that it happened. The moment that would change everything. I'd been having trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of fire and explosions. Around midnight, I finally drifted off into an uneasy slumber. I'm not sure how long I slept before the pain started. A crushing pressure in my chest radiating down my left arm. At first, in the confused state between sleep and waking, I thought it was just another nightmare. But the pain intensified, becoming unbearable. I tried to call out, but no sound came. I couldn't breathe. The pressure was immense, like the entire weight of the ocean was pressing down on me. Dark spots appeared in my vision, expanding rapidly. I remember one clear, calm thought cutting through the pain. So this is how I die. Not in the sea, not in the fire, but in a hospital bed. And then darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. But I was still aware, still thinking, still me. The pain was gone, replaced by a profound sense of floating. I couldn't feel my body, couldn't see anything, but I existed. Somehow I existed. Thomas, a voice, clear as a bell, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Thomas William Hartley. I tried to speak but had no mouth to form words. Yet somehow I communicated. Who's there? A soft glow appeared in the darkness, barely perceptible at first, then growing stronger. It took shapes. Human shapes. Men in naval uniforms standing in formation. As they became clearer, I recognized them. Campbell was at the front, looking exactly as he had the last time I saw him alive, except the perpetual smudges of gun grease on his hands were gone. His farm boy face, usually creased with concentration during drills, was peaceful. Beside him was Wilson, our sight setter, whom I hadn't known was dead. His Yale education had always made him seem slightly out of place in our gun crew, but now he looked like he belonged perfectly where he stood. And there, stepping forward from the formation with that easy smile I knew so well, was Phil Morris. Hey, Tommy, he said, using the nickname I'd always pretended to hate. You're a sight for sore eyes. I still had no sense of having a body, but somehow I was moving toward them. Phil's smile widened as I approached. Am I dead? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not exactly, Phil replied. Not permanently, anyway. You're having what the doctors will call a cardiac event. Stress reaction, they'll say. Your heart stopped beating about 40 seconds ago. This should have terrified me, but in that strange plane of existence, fear seemed a distant concept. I felt only curiosity and a deep sense of reunion. Is this heaven? I asked. Phil laughed, the same rich laugh I remembered. No, not quite. Think of it as a waiting room, a transition point. I looked past him at the formation of men. There were dozens now, then hundreds, stretching back into the glowing distance. I recognized many faces from the Franklin. Others wore uniforms from different eras. Some I recognized as World War I doughboys, others in Civil War blue. We all served, Campbell said, seeming to read my thoughts. Different wars, different ships and units, but we all served. As he spoke, the scene shifted. The formless void was replaced by what looked like the deck of a massive ship, larger than any vessel I'd ever seen. It stretched out impossibly far, gleaming white in an ethereal light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The assembled men stood in perfect formation on this deck, at parade rest, facing me. Why am I here? I asked. Why show me this if I'm going back? Phil stepped closer. Because you have something to do, Tommy. Something important. What? You need to remember, he said. Remember all of us. The ones who didn't come back. I could never forget you, I said, emotion welling up in whatever served as my heart in this place. Not just remember and hear. Phil tapped his temple. But tell our stories. Make sure we're not just our statistics. 800 dead on the Franklin. Thousands in the Pacific. Millions in the war. We were men, Tommy. Men with names and faces and people who loved us. Men who had futures that never happened. As he spoke, each man in the formation seemed to become more distinct, more individual. I could suddenly sense their stories. Campbell and his family farm in Kansas, the sweetheart waiting for him, the little brother who idolized him, Wilson and his poetry, the collection he'd been writing in a water-stained notebook hidden in his bunk, Phil and his plans to take over his father's lumber business, to marry his girl Sarah, to have the 4 kids he'd always wanted. But why me? I asked. Why not someone else? An older figure stepped forward now, one I hadn't noticed before. Chief Donnelly, not the Chief Donnelly I'd left alive on the Santa Fe, but a younger version, as he must have looked during the First World War. Because you listened, Thomas, he said. You always listened. To the men's stories, to their hopes and fears. You keep them in your heart. He gestured toward the vast formation. Some of us die in glory, some in terror, some in simple, terrible accidents. But we all leave behind unfinished symphonies, the music of lives cut short. Someone needs to remember the melodies that never reach their final note. I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what they were asking. I'm just one man. How can I possibly tell all these stories? Phil smiled again. You start with one, then another. The telling itself matters, Tommy. The acknowledgement that we existed, that we mattered. The light was growing brighter now, the edges of the vast ship's deck beginning to blur. You're going back soon, Phil said, his voice starting to sound distant. Your heart will beat again in about 20 seconds. The corpsman checking the ward will notice your distress and call for help. They'll revive you. Wait. I called out, feeling myself being pulled away from them. I don't understand everything yet. Phil's face was kind but serious. You will. In time you will. Just remember your promise. What promise? I asked, the scene fading rapidly. To tell our stories, came his voice now seeming to come from very far away. To carry our message. The light enveloped everything, blindingly bright, then collapsed to a single point. And then true darkness. He's coming back. I've got a pulse. Voices urgent and professional. Hands on my chest. The sting of a needle in my arm. I gasped, air rushing into my lungs like I was surfacing from a deep dive. My eyes flew open to see a ring of concerned faces. A doctor, 2 corpsmen, a nurse. Medical equipment had been rushed to my bedside. You're all right, sailor, the doctor said, his voice steady and reassuring. You had a cardiac arrest, but we've got you stabilized. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. The nurse offered me a sip of water through a straw. Free Phil, I managed to croak. Take it easy, the doctor cautioned. Don't try to talk yet. But I had to. It was already fading, the ship, the formation, the faces. I could feel the details slipping away like water through cupped hands. I saw them, I whispered. All of them. The ones who didn't come back. The medical staff exchanged glances. He's confused from the lack of oxygen, the doctor said to the others. To me, he added, rest now. We'll talk later. But I wasn't confused. Even as the specific images began to blur, the core of the experience remained crystal clear. I had been somewhere else. I had spoken with the dead, and I had been given a task, a purpose. I remember falling back into a deep sleep then, not the troubled nightmares of before, but a profound, healing rest. When I woke again, sunlight was streaming through the windows of the ward. A different doctor was checking my vitals. Well, you gave us quite a scare, Gunner's mate Hartley, he said cheerfully. How are you feeling? Better, I said, surprised to find it was true. The crushing weight of grief that had been with me since the attack seemed to have lifted somewhat. Good, good. Your physical injuries are healing nicely, and your heart rhythm has stabilized. We think the cardiac event was caused by a combination of smoke inhalation, stress, and possibly a minor concussion from the explosion. Nothing to worry about long term. I nodded, not bothering to tell him what I knew, that my heart had stopped because I needed to see something, to learn something. Doctor, I said, do you believe people can come back? From death, I mean. He paused in his note-taking, studying me with new interest. You mean like the stories of the white light, the tunnel, near-death experiences? Something like that. He seemed to consider his words carefully. I'm a medical man, Hartley. I deal in measurable facts. But I've been a doctor long enough to know there are things science can't yet explain. He closed his chart. And I've treated enough men who've been at the edge to know that something profound often happens there. Something that changes them. I appreciated his honesty. It does change you, I said quietly. He patted my shoulder. Whatever you experienced, if it brings you comfort after what you've been through, then it's real enough. Now get some rest. We'll have you back on your feet soon. Over the next few days, my strength returned rapidly. The doctors were surprised by my recovery, but I wasn't. I had a purpose now, a mission entrusted to me by my fallen comrades. That purpose pulled me forward, gave me a reason to heal. I began writing down everything I could remember from my experience. The vast ship deck, the formation of men from different eras, all the details that were already growing hazy. I wrote especially about Phil, Campbell, and Wilson, their faces, their words. I was determined not to lose a single precious detail. A week after my cardiac arrest, I received two pieces of news. First, I was being sent back to the States on a medical transport. My combat days over. Second, a letter arrived from Mary. I knew what it contained before I opened it. Somehow, the knowledge didn't hurt as much as I'd expected. She had indeed fallen in love with David, her co-worker at the aircraft factory. They had married 2 months ago after a whirlwind courtship. She was sorry, so very sorry. But the war had changed everything, and she couldn't promise to wait any longer. I folded the letter carefully and put it away. In another life, the life before the Franklin, before the explosion, before my heart stopped beating, this would have devastated me. Now it seemed like part of a larger pattern, a reshuffling of the deck to set me on a new path. That night, I dreamed of Phil again. Not the ethereal, perfect version from my near-death experience, but the real Phil, laughing, smoking, shuffling cards on his bunk. Sorry about Mary, he said, dealing an imaginary hand. You knew? I asked. He shrugged. Some things are clearer from where I am now. Not everything, but some things. I'm not as upset as I should be, I admitted. Because you understand now that some paths close, so others can open. He looked up from the cards. You've got important work to do, Tommy. Work that might not have happened if you'd gone straight back to Delaware and married Mary. Telling your stories, I said. He nodded. Mine. Campbell's, Wilson's, all of them. The ones who never came home. I woke with the dawn, feeling more certain than ever of my path forward. Whatever skepticism might have lingered about my experience was gone. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had been asked to do. The transport ship taking me and other wounded men back to the States departed Guam on April 12, 1945. The war in the Pacific would rage on for nearly 4 more months. The Franklin, despite catastrophic damage, would make it back to New York under her own power. The most heavily damaged U.S. ship ever to return to port rather than sink. As we sailed eastward across the vast Pacific, I stood at the rail as often as my recovering strength would allow, looking out at the endless blue water. Somewhere out there, the war continued. Ships and planes and men still in the fight. And beneath those same waters lay the remains of ships and planes and men whose fights were finished. I thought of all the stories ending beneath those waves. All the unfinished symphonies, as Chief Donnelly had called them. I couldn't tell them all. No one person could. But I could tell some. I could ensure that at least some of those melodies weren't lost forever. And that would have to be enough. That would be my mission, my message from the other side. I was Thomas William Hartley. I had died aboard the USS Franklin on March 19, 1945. My heart had stopped beating for just over 2 minutes, and I had come back with the voices of the fallen echoing in my mind. Voices that would shape the rest of my life. Voices that demanded to be heard. The trip back to the States took nearly 3 weeks. On calm days, those of us who were mobile enough would gather on deck, sharing stories of home, making plans for our return. The mood was a strange mix of relief at leaving the war behind and guilt for the same reason. Many men spoke of friends they'd left behind, some in graves, others still fighting. I said little during these conversations. What I'd experienced, my brief journey to the other side, wasn't something easily shared. The few times I'd tried to describe it to the ship's chaplain or to fellow sailors I'd grown close to, I'd been met with polite nods and concerned looks. They assumed it was a hallucination brought on by trauma, smoke inhalation, or lack of oxygen to my brain during my cardiac arrest? Maybe they were right. I couldn't prove otherwise. But the vivid reality of what I'd experienced and the sense of purpose it had given me was undeniable. We docked in San Diego on May 3, 1945. The war in Europe was drawing to a close. Hitler had reportedly committed suicide days earlier, and German surrender was imminent. The Pacific War raged on, though none of us could know then that it would end just 3 months later with the dropping of the atomic bombs. From San Diego, we were transferred to various naval hospitals depending on our injuries and home of record. I was sent to the Philadelphia Naval Hospital, just an hour's drive from my hometown of Wilmington. My parents were notified of my arrival, and they were waiting when I was processed in, standing anxiously in the hospital lobby. I'll never forget the look on my mother's face when she saw me. Relief and shock battling for dominance. I'd left home a boy of 22, filled with patriotic fervor and naive courage. I was returning a 24-year-old man with prematurely gray hair at my temples, burned scars on my forearms, and eyes that had seen things they couldn't unsee. "Tommy," she whispered, her hands covering her mouth. Then she was running to me, arms outstretched. I dropped my sea bag and embraced her, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair. Lavender water, the same she'd used all my life. Over her shoulder, I saw my father approaching more slowly. A veteran of the First World War, he understood better than most what homecoming really meant. "Son," was all he said, gripping my shoulder tightly. But his eyes conveyed everything words couldn't. Pride, relief, understanding, and a shared knowledge of what war does to a man. The doctors at Philadelphia kept me for 2 more weeks, running tests on my heart, treating the last of my physical injuries. They pronounced me recovered, but advised against strenuous activity for at least 6 months. I was honorably discharged with a Purple Heart, a handful of campaign medals, and a 30% disability rating for cardiac irregularity and respiratory complications. Going home to Wilmington was both comforting and disorienting. My childhood bedroom remained untouched. High school pennants on the walls, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, books neatly arranged on shelves. It felt like a museum to a person who no longer existed. The first few weeks were a blur of well-meaning visitors, congratulations on my safe return, awkward questions about the war that I couldn't or wouldn't answer truthfully. Old friends dropped by, including some who'd served in different theaters and understood the strange limbo of being home while the war continued elsewhere. I avoided Mary. She'd sent another letter to the hospital asking to see me, to explain in person. I wrote back that there was nothing to explain, no hard feelings, but I wasn't ready to see her yet. Maybe someday, but not now. The truth was, her betrayal seemed insignificant compared to everything else I'd experienced. My heart had fractured in ways that made romantic disappointment seem trivial. My father, ever practical, suggested I return to work at the hardware store once my health allowed. "Business has been good," he said over dinner one night. "Government contracts for the war effort. I could use the help, and it would be yours someday." I nodded noncommittally. The family business had been my assumed future before the war. Now it felt like a path that belonged to someone else. At night, when the house was quiet and dark, the memories would come, not just of the explosions and fire and death, but of that other place. The vast ship deck. The formation of men from every era. Phil's voice explaining my mission. In the stillness of midnight, those memories grew sharper, more insistent. I started writing again, filling notebook after notebook with details of my experience. I recorded everything I could remember about Phil, about Campbell and Wilson, about all the men I'd known who hadn't come home. Their hometowns, their quirks and habits, the stories they'd told during long watches, their hopes for after the war. I was terrified of forgetting anything, of failing in my promise. My mother found me one night, around 3 a.m., hunched over my desk writing frantically by lamplight. She stood in the doorway in her robe, concern etched on her face. "Tommy," she said gently, "you need to sleep." I looked up, blinking, as if waking from a trance. "I can't let them fade away, Mom." "I promised." She came to stand beside me, resting a hand on my shoulder. Her eyes fell on the pages covered in my increasingly cramped handwriting. "Philip Morris," she read. "He was your friend?" I nodded. "Best friend I made in the Navy. He died when the Franklin was hit." Her hand tightened on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, son. But I saw him again," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. When my heart stopped in the hospital, I saw Phil and Campbell and Wilson and hundreds of others. They were waiting for me. I expected disbelief, concern, perhaps a gentle suggestion that I speak to the doctor about these delusions. Instead, my mother pulled up a chair and sat beside me. "Tell me," she said simply. So I did. Everything. The pain in my chest, the darkness, the light, the vast ship deck, the formation of men, Phil's message. I spoke for nearly an hour, the words pouring out in a torrent after being bottled up for so long. When I finished, my mother was silent for a long moment, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your grandmother, my mother, had a saying," she finally said. "Death is not extinguishing the light. It is only putting out the lamp because the dawn has come." She took my hand in hers. "I believe you, Tommy. I believe you saw the dawn." Something tight inside my chest loosened at her words. Someone believed me. Someone understood. "What am I supposed to do now, Mom?" I asked, suddenly feeling very young again. "How do I keep my promise to them?" She looked at the notebook spread across my desk. "You've already started. You're preserving their memory." She paused, thinking. "Your father's sister, your Aunt Ruth in Philadelphia. She works for the War Department, doesn't she? In casualty notification?" I nodded. Ruth had mentioned her work in letters, though never in detail. It was too painful. "Maybe she could help you locate the families of your friends. If you wanted to share your memories with them, let them know their sons and husbands and brothers aren't forgotten." The idea took root immediately. Of course, that's what Phil had meant. Not just to remember them myself, but to ensure their stories continued through the people who had loved them. "I'll write to Aunt Ruth tomorrow," I said, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since that moment on the ethereal ship. True to her word, my mother supported me. She helped me draft the letter to Aunt Ruth, carefully explaining what I wanted to do without mentioning my near-death experience. We simply said I wanted to reach out to the families of men I'd served with who hadn't made it home. Aunt Ruth's reply came 10 days later, cautiously supportive, but with a warning. "The wounds are very fresh for these families," she wrote. "Approach with care and respect. Some may not wish to hear from you." She included contact information for the families of 3 men from my gun crew, Campbell, Wilson, and Harris, who had transferred to another ship just before the attack and died later at Okinawa. I wrote to Campbell's family first. They lived on a farm outside Topeka, Kansas. I spent days drafting the letter, agonizing over every word. How much should I tell them? Would they want to know the exact circumstances of their son's death? Would they think me crazy if I mentioned my cardiac arrest and what I'd seen? In the end, I kept it simple and honest. I introduced myself as a member of Campbell's gun crew on the Franklin. I expressed my condolences for their loss and shared some memories of their son, his incredible strength, his quiet competence, his kindness to new sailors. I mentioned that he had spoken often of his family and the farm, that he had carried a photo of them all standing by a red barn. I didn't mention seeing him after death. That could come later, if at all. I mailed the letter with shaking hands, half expecting never to hear back. Why would they want to be reminded of their pain by a stranger? But a reply came 3 weeks later, a thick envelope in feminine handwriting. It was from Campbell's mother, Martha. "Daha, dear Mr. Hartley," she began, "your letter brought both tears and comfort to our home. To know that someone who was with our Robert in his final days took the time to reach out to us means more than I can express. We have received the official notification in his personal effects, but these tell us nothing of his life aboard ship, the man he had become in the Navy." She went on to thank me for the specific memories I'd shared and asked if I might have others. "Even the smallest detail is precious to us now," she wrote. "Did he speak of home often? Did he receive our packages? Was he afraid or was he brave at the end?" I wrote back immediately, sharing everything I could remember. His pride in being the strongest man in our gun crew, how he would organize arm wrestling tournaments during downtime, his habit of reading comic books and passing them around afterward, how he kept a small Bible his grandfather had carried in the Spanish-American War, how grateful he was for the homemade fudge his mother sent, which he shared generously. I didn't tell her that her son had died instantly in the third explosion, likely never knowing what hit him. Instead, I wrote that he had died doing his duty, alongside men who respected him deeply. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Martha Campbell's second letter arrived with a small package, a piece of homemade fudge wrapped carefully in wax paper. "Robert's favorite," her note explained. "I thought you might like to taste what he enjoyed so much." That small act of kindness broke something open inside me. I sat at my desk holding that piece of fudge and wept for the first time since the Franklin was hit. Not just for Campbell, but for all of them. For Phil, for Wilson, for every man who would never come home. When I recovered, I wrote to Wilson's family in Connecticut and to Harris's in Oregon. Both responded with gratitude similar to the Campbells. Wilson's father, a professor at Yale, asked thoughtful questions about his son's last months. Harris's young widow sent a photo of their baby daughter, born 2 months after her father died, and asked if I would consider being her godfather, a connection to the man she would never know. Word spread somehow among the Franklin survivors. Letters began arriving from men I'd served with but lost touch with after our rescue. Reynolds, my gun captain, wrote from California where he was working as a high school teacher again. He'd heard I was contacting families and wanted to add his memories to mine. Peterson, our phone talker, visited in person while passing through Delaware on his way home to Minnesota. We sat on my parents' porch late into the night, talking about the men we'd lost. He confided that he'd been having nightmares, explosions, fire, screaming men. "Do you think they're at peace?" he asked suddenly, his voice small in the darkness. "The guys who didn't make it?" I hesitated, then decided to trust him with the truth. "Yes," I said firmly. "I know they are." "How can you be so sure?" I took a deep breath. "Because I saw them. When my heart stopped in that hospital on Guam, I saw them. All of them. Campbell, Wilson, Phil Morris. Hundreds of others. They were waiting, standing in formation on this enormous ship, at peace." I expected skepticism, maybe even mockery. Instead, Peterson stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said. "My grandmother used to say that sometimes the veil gets thin, and we can see through to the other side. I think you saw through the veil, Hartley." His acceptance gave me courage. As I continued corresponding with families and other survivors, I began carefully sharing more of my experience. Not with everyone, and not all at once, but with those who seemed open to it. Some were indeed skeptical. Wilson's father, the Yale professor, wrote a kind but firmly rational response suggesting that oxygen deprivation can cause vivid hallucinations. Others were more receptive. Phil Morris's mother wrote that she had always sensed her son was at peace, and my experience confirmed what her heart already knew. 6 months after my discharge, I made a decision. The hardware store wasn't my future. My father was disappointed but understanding. "You've got to follow your own path, son," he said, closing up the shop one evening. "The war changed you. It changed all of you. No shame in that." I enrolled at the University of Delaware on the GE Bill, studying psychology and literature, tools I hoped to better understand and communicate what I'd experienced and the stories I was collecting. During breaks, I began traveling to meet the families in person, recording their memories of the men I'd served with, adding depth and context to my own recollections. The Campbell farm in Kansas became a second home. Martha and William Campbell welcomed me like a son, insisting I stay with them whenever I visited. Their red barn was exactly as Robert had described it. They showed me his childhood bedroom, his high school football trophies, the workshop where he and his father had built furniture together. He was more than a sailor, more than a casualty, William told me as we walked the perimeter of their wheat fields one evening. Here he was, Robbie, the boy who could throw a baseball clear across this field. The teenager who took apart and rebuilt a tractor engine when he was 16. The young man who proposed to his sweetheart under that oak tree. I began to understand that my mission was larger than I'd initially thought. It wasn't just about remembering the men I'd known in the Navy. It was about preserving the fullness of lives interrupted. The sailors who died were also sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They were baseball players and mechanics, dancers and dreamers, men with plans that would never come to fruition. In my junior year of college, I had an experience that removed any lingering doubts about what I'd seen during my cardiac arrest. I was visiting Phil Morris's parents in Georgia, staying in their guest room, which had once been Phil's bedroom. His model ship still lined the bookshelves. His high school pennants still hung on the walls. Late that night, I woke suddenly from a deep sleep. The room was dark except for moonlight filtering through the curtains, but I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. I sat up, heart racing. "Hello?" I whispered. There was no response, but the air seemed to thicken, becoming almost tangible. The temperature dropped noticeably. Then, like a radio gradually being tuned to the right frequency, I heard it. Phil's laugh. Not in my mind, but in the room, as clear as if he were sitting at the foot of the bed. "I told you you'd find your way, Tommy," his voice said. Then more softly, "Thank you for coming here. For talking to them. It helps." "Phil?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Is that really you?" The laugh again, warm and familiar. "Who else would it be?" "Keep going, buddy. You're doing good work." The presence faded gradually, the room warming again, the air returning to normal. I sat awake for hours afterward, processing what had happened. It wasn't frightening, quite the opposite. It felt like a confirmation, a cosmic pat on the back. I told Phil's parents about the experience over breakfast the next morning. Many people would have kept such an encounter to themselves, fearing ridicule or concern about their mental state. But something in their faces, a desperate hope, a need to believe their son wasn't completely gone, made me take the risk. I know how this will sound. I began carefully. But I think Phil visited me last night. In my room, his room. His mother, Grace, dropped her fork with a clatter. His father, Henry, went very still. What did he say? Grace asked in a whisper. I told them everything. The laugh, the words, the feeling of his presence. When I finished, they were both crying, but they were smiling through their tears. We felt him too, Henry admitted. Little things, his favorite records playing by themselves. The smell of his aftershave when no one's been in his room. We thought we were imagining it, or just hoping too hard. You weren't, I assured them. He's still here. Not trapped or unhappy, just looking out for you. That visit marked a turning point in my mission. I began to understand that what I was doing wasn't just about preserving memories. It was about healing. The families I connected with, the survivors I corresponded with, even myself, we were all healing through the sharing of these stories. By the time I graduated college in 1949, I had compiled hundreds of pages of memories, photos, and letters. The project had evolved from personal catharsis to something larger. A professor in the English department suggested I consider turning the material into a book. These stories deserve a wider audience, he said, reviewing my manuscripts, especially now as the country moves on and the war fades from immediate memory. The idea was daunting. I was a sailor-turned-student, not an author. But the thought of these men, their lives, their sacrifices, their continued presence beyond death, reaching more people was compelling. I spent the next 2 years organizing my materials, conducting additional interviews, and shaping the narrative. The result was a manuscript titled Unfinished Symphonies, The Lives and Afterlives of USS Franklin Sailors. It wasn't a conventional war memoir. It was part biography, part spiritual exploration, part psychological study of grief and memory. Finding a publisher wasn't easy. Most were looking for straightforward war heroics or technical analyses of battles. The spiritual elements of my manuscript made many editors uncomfortable. Too religious for a war book, too martial for a religious book. One rejection letter stated, finally, a small but respected publisher specializing in military history took a chance on it. The editor, a World War II veteran himself, told me, I don't know if I believe everything in here, Hartley, but I believe you believe it, and these men's stories need to be told, however they come to us. Unfinished Symphonies was published in the spring of 1952. Initial sales were modest but steady. Reviews were mixed. Some praised the detailed portraits of the sailors and the intimate glimpses of shipboard life, while others were skeptical of the near-death experience and spiritual elements. Then something unexpected happened. Letters began arriving from across the country, not just from Franklin survivors or military families, but from ordinary readers who had lost loved ones in the war, or in accidents, or to illness. They wrote of finding comfort in the possibility that death wasn't an ending. Some shared their own experiences of sensing departed loved ones, or having unexplainable encounters that suggested continued existence beyond physical death. A particularly moving letter came from a mother in Nebraska whose son had died at Normandy. I have felt my boy near me many times. She wrote, but feared speaking of it lest people think me crazy with grief. Your book gave me permission to trust my own experience. For that, I cannot thank you enough. The book began to find its audience, not necessarily among military history buffs, but among those seeking meaning in loss, assurance that their loved ones weren't simply gone. A second printing was ordered, then a third. I began receiving invitations to speak at veterans organizations, grief support groups, and spiritual communities. I was no longer just a veteran with an unusual story. I had become a messenger of sorts, a bridge between the living and those who had passed on. Not everyone welcomed my message, of course. Traditional religious authorities sometimes viewed my experiences as theologically suspect. Scientific skeptics dismissed them as hallucinations or wishful thinking. I encountered my share of hostile questioning and outright dismissal. But for every skeptic, there seemed to be someone who found resonance and comfort in what I shared. And increasingly, other veterans began sharing similar experiences with me. Moments when they too had glimpsed something beyond the veil, often in combat or near-death situations. A former Marine who had been left for dead at Peleliu described floating above his body and seeing his fallen comrades waiting at the periphery of his vision. An army nurse who had nearly died of typhus in a field hospital in Italy spoke of meeting deceased patients in a garden of impossible beauty. A Coast Guardsman who had drowned and been revived during a rescue operation recalled being welcomed by shipmates lost earlier in the war. Each story was unique, yet patterns emerged. The presence of those who had gone before, a sense of peace and purpose, the cessation of physical pain, the reluctance to return to life coupled with a sense of mission once they did return. I began collecting these accounts as well, sensing that they were part of the same larger story I had been tasked with telling. The message from beyond wasn't just for me. It was being delivered through many messengers in many forms. In 1955, I received a letter that would open yet another chapter in my journey. It was from Dr. Eleanor Bridges, a researcher at the newly formed Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach. She had read my book and was conducting a study on near-death experiences among combat veterans. Your account contains several elements commonly reported in such experiences, she wrote, but also unique aspects that may be culturally specific to military personnel. I would be grateful for the opportunity to interview you in person and perhaps include your case in our ongoing research. I agreed to meet with her, curious about this scientific approach to what I had experienced as deeply spiritual. Dr. Bridges was a petite, silver-haired woman with keen blue eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that belied her interest in metaphysical matters. Mr. Hartley, she said when we met in her office overlooking the Atlantic, I want to be clear that I approach these phenomena with an open mind but scientific rigor. I'm neither looking to prove nor disprove the reality of your experience, but to understand it in the context of human consciousness. I appreciated her honesty. That's all I've ever wanted as well, Dr. Bridges, to understand what happened to me and why. Over several days of interviews, she had me recount my experience in minute detail, sometimes asking me to revisit specific moments multiple times to check for consistency. She compared elements of my account with others in her files, noting similarities and differences. The vast ship you described, she said during one session, appears in numerous accounts from naval personnel, while Army veterans often report finding themselves in a vast field or plain. Air Force pilots sometimes describe an endless sky. The setting seems to reflect the individual's military service. That makes sense, I replied. We understand the unknown in terms of what's familiar. She nodded. Yet certain elements remain consistent across all accounts. The presence of deceased comrades, the sense of being given a choice or mission, the profound peace. These transcend branch of service, nationality, even historical era. Her research gave me a framework for understanding my experience that neither dismissed it as delusion nor required literal religious interpretation. It was a deeply human experience, shaped by my background but connected to something universal. Dr. Bridges introduced me to others studying similar phenomena, psychologists, neurologists, theologians from various traditions. I found myself part of a growing community of researchers and experiencers trying to map the boundaries between life and death, consciousness and transcendence. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, I continued to write and speak about my experiences and the stories I had collected. 2 more books followed: Messengers, Veterans' Encounters with the Afterlife, in 1958, and The Thin Veil, Death and Beyond in Military Experience. In 1963, I never married. Mary reached out several times over the years, eventually divorced from David, suggesting we might reconnect. But my life had taken a direction that didn't leave room for the kind of relationship she wanted. My work, my mission, consumed me. The men I had promised to remember, Phil, Campbell, Wilson, and hundreds more I had come to know through my research, were my constant companions. That's not to say I was lonely. Far from it. I built deep friendships with fellow researchers, with the families of the fallen I had connected with veterans who shared similar experiences. My apartment in Virginia Beach, where I moved to be closer to Dr. Bridges' research center, was rarely empty of visitors. Colleagues debating the latest research, veterans sharing their stories, family members seeking connection with lost loved ones. And sometimes in the quiet moments between, I would feel them. Phil most often, but others too. Not as dramatic appearances, but as a presence, a warmth, a subtle indication that the veil between worlds was indeed thin and permeable. As I entered my 50s, then my 60s, I began to think about legacy. The sailors of the Franklin were well remembered now, not just through my work, but through memorial associations, reunions, historical archives. But what of the larger message? The confirmation that death is not an ending, that those who go before us remain connected in ways we're only beginning to understand? In 1985, 40 years after the Franklin was hit, I returned to the Pacific for the first time since the war. A group of researchers investigating consciousness had organized a conference in Hawaii, and I was invited to speak about my experiences. While there, I took the opportunity to board a small chartered boat and sail to approximately the area where the Franklin had been attacked. I was an old man now, 72, my hair fully white, my once athletic frame softened by age. As we reached the coordinates I had provided the captain, he cut the engines, allowing the boat to drift gently in the vast blue emptiness. "We're here, Mr. Hartley," he said, gesturing to the open sea. "As close as I can get you, given the records." I thanked him and moved to the railing, looking out at the peaceful water. It was hard to reconcile this tranquil scene with the hell of fire and explosion I had experienced here 4 decades earlier. Hard to believe that hundreds of men had died in these waters, that I had nearly joined them. I had brought a small wreath of Hawaiian flowers. As I prepared to cast it onto the waves, something extraordinary happened. The clear blue sky darkened slightly, as if a cloud had passed overhead. But there were no clouds. The air became perfectly still, and then I heard it, very faintly at first, then growing stronger, the sound of men's voices raised in song, the Navy hymn, "Eternal Father, strong to save," the traditional hymn for those in peril on the sea. I looked around wildly, thinking another boat must be approaching, but we were alone on the water. The captain was in the wheelhouse, too far away to be the source. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me like an embrace. And then I saw them, not with my physical eyes, but with some inner sense that was equally real. They stood in formation on the water itself, hundreds of them in dress whites, perfectly aligned as if on a parade ground. Phil was there at the front, and Campbell and Wilson. My friends from the Franklin, and others I had come to know through my research. Sailors from 100 different ships, a dozen different wars, united in this moment. Tears flowed freely down my cheeks as I cast the wreath onto the water. The singing gradually faded. The light returned to normal, but the sense of their presence lingered. The boat captain emerged from the wheelhouse, a strange expression on his face. "Did you hear that?" he asked hesitantly. I froze. "Hear what?" "Singing. Men's voices. Singing some kind of hymn." He looked embarrassed to be mentioning it. "Must have been the wind playing tricks." "Yes," I said, smiling through my tears. "The wind. Or something like that." That moment of shared perception, someone else hearing what I had heard, was a final validation, a gift as I entered the last chapters of my life. The captain hadn't seen what I had seen, but he had heard the voices. The veil had thinned not just for me, but for him as well. In the decades since my cardiac arrest aboard that hospital ship, I had come to understand that the message I was given wasn't just about remembering the fallen, though that remained important. It was about something larger, the continuity of consciousness, the persistence of identity beyond physical death, the connections that transcend the boundary we call death. I have spent my life carrying that message, finding others who have glimpsed the same truth, collecting their stories, helping them understand and integrate their experiences. I have watched as near-death experiences have moved from the realm of superstition to serious scientific inquiry. I have seen the comfort these accounts bring to the grieving, the perspective they offer to the dying, the meaning they provide to survivors. I am an old man now as I record these words. My hair is white, my hands spotted with age, my steps slow and measured. But I am not afraid of what comes next. I have seen beyond the veil. I have spoken with those who wait there. I know that when my time comes, truly comes, not just the brief glimpse I was granted all those years ago, I will be welcomed by a formation of men in white, standing at parade rest on the deck of an impossibly vast ship. Phil will step forward, that easy smile on his face, and say, "Welcome home, Tommy." Well done. And Campbell will be there, strong as ever, no longer the farm boy from Kansas, but something more. Himself, but perfected. Wilson, the Yale student whose poetry I helped publish posthumously, whose words now teach young people about war and sacrifice. All of them waiting. Not because I'm special, not because I've earned some unique reward, but because that's what awaits all of us. Reunion, recognition, return. The completion of our unfinished symphonies. So if you're watching this, if you're listening to my story, know this. Those you've lost are not gone. The veil between worlds is thin, Sometimes in quiet moments, if you listen carefully, you might hear them. A familiar laugh, a snatch of song, a whispered reassurance. That's not wishful thinking or grief playing tricks on your mind. It's a message from the other side. The same message I was given when I died aboard the USS Franklin in 1945 and was sent back to share. We go on, all of us, and we wait for you. Until then, remember us, not just as names on memorials or faces in faded photographs, but as we truly were, living, loving, laughing human beings whose songs continue, even when you can no longer hear them clearly. Listen for us in the quiet moments. We're still here. We've always been here, just on the other side of the thinnest veil